I've said this before, faith is not just belief. When Jesus says to his disciples, faith as small as a mustard seed can move a mountain, this is what they think of. I want to tell you a little about some history that the disciples knew about that might help make this make sense. And some of you know a little about the history of God's people, but most of you probably don't know this history. This might be helpful, okay? About 1,000 years before Jesus came on the scene, God's people were certain that they needed a temple. The temple was more than what we think of today when we hear Jewish temple. A lot of us hear temple, we think of a small local church or a synagogue, but the temple for them was like the major central location for so much of their faith. There was only one temple. It was in Jerusalem, and it was where God's people offered sacrifices. It would be where the priests would meet and decide major things for all the people. But most significantly, it would be where God lived. He was said to dwell in the temple. And so if you were a follower of God in the Old Testament, 1,000 years leading up to Jesus, you could count on having your greatest spiritual experiences at the temple. For so many, it was a place of spiritual awakening. Well, King Solomon built this temple on the top of Mount Moriah in Jerusalem. And tens of thousands of men were needed for this gigantic undertaking. Men were sent to Lebanon to chop down cedar trees. Stones were cut in quarries and brought up to Mount Moriah to be used in construction where they would be fitted together. Ships set sail east and west to go get and bring back the finest materials. No power tools, no cranes, no modern conveniences that we have. And it took a total of 7 years to build the temple. And for the next 410 years, many people would bring daily offerings. In fact, the entire nation would gather 3 times a year to be seen by God. It was everything that it was supposed to be until the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar waged war on the people of God, destroying much of Jerusalem, including all of the temple, this thing that meant so much in their lives. Now just imagine that for a second, would you? 7 years worth of building, again, thousands of men's worth of work destroyed. It was horrible for the people. Some of you know that the people were carried off to exile in Babylon. When we hear exile, we think of these people that were captured, and that is true. But really, we're talking about the survivors, because many, many people died in the destruction of Jerusalem. It was a terrible time. Well, 53 years later, a new king in Babylon decides to let God's people go back home. The survivors and their descendants are allowed to go back to Jerusalem. And a few start to get excited because this means they can rebuild their lives and rebuild their people. And most significantly, they can rebuild their temple. The thought, sure, it might take us 7 years like it took last time, but we'll do it. And they set out with faith. One of those people was a man named Zerubbabel. In fact, he had been appointed the leader of God's people, even in Babylon, and he personally led over 42,000 Jews back from exile, back to Jerusalem. Now, just a quick time out. This is huge. Jesus, his disciples, anyone living in this area that Jesus is teaching and doing his ministry, they knew the story of Zerubbabel and the 42,000 people coming back. It's like the story of Moses and the Israelites crossing the Red Sea, or Noah and his ark. They knew about this return to Jerusalem. These are their ancestors who came back to rebuild the world that these guys now live in. So what we read in the Bible is that Zerubbabel and all of these people, they make it back to Jerusalem where they have not been in years. By the way, I should just say this journey from Babylon would have taken them 4 months. A long journey, a journey of hope, hoping for 4 months. We're going to do this again. But when they finally get there, ready to take on the job, what they see is a pile of ruins. Just imagine that for a second. So excited to go home. So many who when they left, they were just little kids. They maybe weren't even born yet, who heard about this place called Jerusalem and this wonderful architecture built by thousands of men over 7 years, this place where God lived, the temple. Imagine growing up hearing your parents and your aunts and your uncles say, someday we'll go back. Maybe not my generation, but yours will go back. And you will rebuild the temple, and God will dwell with us, his people again. Oh, and what if they had always told you, the building is going to go much faster this time? Because now we know what we're doing. And we have all sorts of modern technology these days in 600 BC. It took us 7 years. We could probably do it in 3 now. Imagine those conversations and those expectations, and you've traveled 4 months, and you walk into Jerusalem to see the temple, and instead what you see is this gargantuan building completely collapsed into a huge pile of rubble. Okay, speaking of piles of rubble, have I ever told you about the house we first bought when we moved to Livermore? The house itself was fine. It was in good shape. But the yard, the people who had lived in the home before us had abandoned the outside front and back and just let this fall to ruin. And as I say that, you might think, oh, so it was overgrown. Maybe there were a few dead bushes. You had a blank slate to start over. I wish I meant that. I have worked with a blank slate before. I have landscaped a blank slate. This was not a blank slate. This was a stagnant 4-foot pond that weird rodents were drinking from when we walked into the backyard. There were vegetable planters that had fallen apart. There was a sprinkler system that had been half ripped out of the ground. A tree growing into phone lines and power lines that had been trimmed so many weird ways over the years that it no longer looked like a tree, the eyesore of the neighborhood. One time we saw a raccoon jump from a fence into a bush and never come out again. Really, we watched for hours. I cannot go into enough detail about how bad this yard was. Andrea would not let the kids go in the backyard. And I thought to myself when we bought the house, how bad can this be to start over? I have now learned how bad it can be. There's a reason that everywhere you go in older countries than ours, you will find ancient ruins. It's because no one wants to clean them up. I have learned this the hard way. So Zerubbabel and God's people arrive, and they see these ruins, and they get scared. And they get tired just looking at it. And they say, oh my gosh, this is going to take forever. It's not doable. There is a mountain, a literal mountain of ruin. We had no idea that this is what we were in for. They as a nation are on the verge of giving up, and they have not even begun. Well, in this moment, God sends a prophet named Zechariah. He is sent to talk to Zerubbabel and God's people. They're paralyzed at this daunting task in front of them. They're ready to quit, return to Babylon, or just go start over somewhere else. And Zechariah hears from God something he's supposed to tell Zerubbabel. Zechariah 4, verse 7. What are you, mighty mountain? Before Zerubbabel, you will become level ground. Let me read that part again. What are you, mighty mountain? Before Zerubbabel, you will become level ground. It goes on to say, Zerubbabel will bring out the capstone to shouts of God bless it, God bless it. Verse 9, that the hands of Zerubbabel will lay the foundation of this temple. His hands will also complete it. And then you will know that the Lord Almighty has sent me to you. God is with you. God's people come back to Jerusalem. They come back to rebuild their lives and rebuild the temple, and they find that they come back to a mountain of rubble, and they panic. They don't think they can do it, and they get ready to give up, and God sends somebody to tell them that mountain, that literal mountain that is standing in your way will get moved. Now, we'll talk about how in just a second, but it is so important that you know that story. Because when Jesus says to his disciples, faith as small as a mustard seed can move a mountain, this is what they think of. A pile of rubble getting out of the way so God's people can rebuild, and his plan can be rebuilt in the lives of his people. Let me make sure you get that. Jesus uses this imagery that they're familiar with. Moving mountains to them is common vernacular for getting the obstacles out of your life so you can carry on with God's plan. Just to show you how true that is, I'm not making that up. Let me take it one step further. There were rabbis in Jesus' time. This is not a joke, not making this up. They were affectionately referred to, these rabbis, as mountain movers. You know how we say that person's a real mover, a real shaker? And we know what that means. That's somebody with influence. It's somebody who can get things done. All right, by the time Jesus comes on the scene, there were certain rabbis that were called movers of mountains. And that was a reference to Zerubbabel and what happened to clear the rubble so that he could rebuild the temple. I say that to say there is no doubt when Jesus says you can move a mountain, his disciples know the story that he's talking about, the time that they got the mountain of rubble out of the way so they could rebuild their lives and follow God's plan. So how did Zerubbabel do it? How did God's people get the mountain out of the way and get it moved? Was it just by believing? Was it their faith? Did they levitate it in one big chunk off the temple foundations over to a new garbage pile somewhere, Yoda style? Well, once they heard from Zechariah, what'd they do? One piece at a time, the people of God picked away at the mountain of rubble and they moved it somewhere else. One brick, one log, one huge stone every day, day after day, piece after piece, and the mountain was moved. Doing it that way, how long do you think it took to rebuild the temple? First time, 7 years. Second time, partly because of this mountain of ruins, 46 years. But they did it. They didn't quit. They didn't give up. They moved the mountain. There's one thing that God told Zerubbabel that we have not yet read. It's important that you know this. Zechariah tells him, look at chapter 4, verse 6. God said, you will do this not by might, not by power, but by my spirit. Zerubbabel, you will move this mountain, but it will not be by might. In other words, it will not be some supernatural strength that I give you that makes everything easy. And God says, you will move it, but it will not be by power. I'm not going to just levitate the mountain and give you a blank slate to start over. But Zerubbabel, you can do this using your own hands and your own back and your own sweat because my spirit will be with you. Not by might, not by power, but by my spirit. Put your confidence in me, your trust in me. Don't quit. I will help you finish this. Don't give up. See, when Jesus tells his disciples you can move mountains, what he means is you can finish what seems like unfinishable work. He will help you complete what seems like an impossible task. And the reason is because God is all about helping his people get rid of the mountains of rubble, the obstacles that are keeping his plan from happening in their lives. And Jesus says, you can finish the thing that seems impossible to finish if you have faith, and like Zerubbabel, you don't give up. Let's talk about faith for a minute. Faith is small as a mustard seed. I've said this before. Faith is not just belief. We have greatly watered down faith. If I just believe really hard, if I concentrate, if I say some special words, okay, that is not faith. Faith is more than believing. Faith is trusting. In fact, sometimes faith shows itself most when you have trouble believing, when you look at something that seems undoable and deep down you've got doubts God can do anything about it, but you always choose to trust and live as if he will anyway. That's faith. And that is the faith of Zerubbabel, a guy who saw something impossible and moved forward into 46 years of hard work because even though he had doubts, he was going to trust and act in obedience. When Jesus said, if you have faith, you can move a mountain, what he means is, if you would trust me, if you would trust God, if even in the middle of your doubt, you would be obedient to what he's asked you to do, if you would do that, you could clear obstacles and you could rebuild and you could finish the things that seem like impossible tasks in your life.